There are sounds that mark time more reliably than any clock, rhythms so precise and unchanging that they become the invisible architecture around which we build our days. For Arjun Mehta, that sound was the soft metallic click of his mailbox opening at exactly 6:40 a.m. every weekday, followed by the gentle thud of something being deposited, then the click again as the mailbox closed. From his bed in apartment 3B, a modest one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a aging building in a middle-class neighborhood where nothing much happened and nobody paid particular attention to anyone else, Arjun could hear this sound clearly through the thin walls. He'd learned to wake just before it happened, his internal clock calibrated over months to this daily arrival, his consciousness surfacing from sleep with that particular anxiety of anticipating something he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. 6:37 a.m. His eyes would open, finding the ceiling fan's slow rotation in the gray pre-dawn light filtering through curtains he never quite closed all the way. 6:38 a.m. He'd listened to the building's morning sounds, water running in pipes as neighbors showered, the distant clang of the building's elevator, footsteps in the apartment above. 6:39 a.m. He'd hold his breath without meaning to, waiting. 6:40 a.m. click. Thud. Click. And somewhere deep in his chest, something would tighten. Arjun Mehta was 36 years old and had perfected the art of living an invisible life. He worked as a data analyst for a mid-sized financial services company, a job that required him to sit at a desk for 9 hours daily, transforming raw numbers into patterns and predictions, finding meaning in statistics while carefully avoiding finding any meaning in his own existence. He was good at his work, competent, reliable, thorough, in the way that people are good at things that don't require them to be particularly present or engaged. His co-workers knew him as polite but distant. He said good morning and good evening at appropriate times, responded to work emails within reasonable time frames, attended mandatory meetings with his camera on but his actual attention elsewhere. He had a desk in an open-plan office by a window that faced a concrete wall, and he'd been sitting at that desk for 7 years without anyone suggesting he might want a better view. He was the kind of person you worked alongside for years without really knowing, whose absence you might not notice until you needed something from them and realized they weren't there. His apartment reflected this same quality of careful invisibility. The furniture was functional but generic, a couch that came with the place, a dining table he never ate at, a bed he'd bought from a big box store and assembled himself, following instructions with the same methodical attention he brought to spreadsheets. The walls were painted landlord beige and held no photographs, no artwork, nothing that suggested a personality or history or any life beyond the most basic requirements of existence. The kitchen was used primarily for making tea. He drank it constantly, black with no sugar, the same brand his mother had kept in the house when he was growing up. The refrigerator held minimal supplies, milk that often went bad before he finished it, some vegetables in various states of decay, condiments inherited from a past self who'd apparently once planned to cook. Mostly he ate at work or ordered takeout that he consumed while scrolling through his phone, absorbing content without retaining it, letting the noise of other people's lives drown out the silence of his own. He avoided mirrors. This was deliberate. His apartment's bathroom mirror was positioned such that he could shave and brush his teeth without making direct eye contact with himself, and he developed the skill of moving through the world without catching his own reflection in windows or polished surfaces. When forced to see himself, in elevator mirrors or the glass walls of conference rooms, he looked away quickly, discomfited by whatever he saw there. Routine was Arjun's primary defense against the messiness of existence. He woke at the same time, at 6:37 now, anticipating the mail. He showered using the same movements, a choreography so familiar his body executed it while his mind went elsewhere. He dressed from a wardrobe of essentially identical clothing, gray or blue button-down shirts, black or navy trousers, the same brown shoes he'd been wearing for 3 years. He left his apartment at 7:45, caught the 8:03 bus from the stop 3 blocks away, arrived at work by 8:40, ate lunch at his desk at 1 p.m., left at 6 p.m., returned home by 7:15, made tea, ordered or prepared minimal food, existed quietly until sleep came to rescue him from consciousness. This routine had calcified over time until it was less a choice than a groove worn so deep he couldn't climb out even if he wanted to. Which he didn't. Routine felt safe. Routine meant not thinking, not feeling, not remembering. The letters had disrupted this routine 6 months after his mother died. Malini Mehta had been 63 when the stroke took her, sudden, massive, unsurvivable despite the doctor's best efforts. One moment she'd been making chai in her kitchen, humming an old Hindi film song the way she always did. The next, she was on the floor, and by the time Arjun's younger brother Dev had found her, Dev still lived at home, worked nearby, checked on her daily. It was already too late for anything except the awful logistics of death, ambulances, hospitals, machines that sustained functions without restoring consciousness, decisions about whether to keep trying, funerals, cremations, the grinding bureaucracy of paperwork that follows every death. Arjun had gone through it all with the same numb efficiency he brought to data analysis. Made arrangements. Signed documents. Stood at the funeral receiving condolences with appropriate expressions. Returned to work after the standard bereavement leave. Resumed his routine. Except he avoided calling Dev, avoided sorting through their mother's belongings. Avoided thinking about the fact that her last call to him, 3 days before she died, while he was in a meeting, had gone to voicemail, and he'd meant to call her back but hadn't, and now never would. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday, 6 months and 4 days after the funeral. Arjun heard the 6:40 click-thud click, but that morning he'd overslept slightly, so he didn't retrieve the mail until he was leaving for work. He opened his mailbox expecting the usual bills and junk mail, and found instead a cream-colored envelope with his name handwritten on the front in black ink, Arjun Mehta, apartment 3B. No return address. No postmark. As if it had been hand-delivered directly to his mailbox. The paper was good quality, thick, slightly textured, the kind used for formal correspondence or wedding invitations. The handwriting was elegant but informal, cursive but legible. Something about it felt disturbingly familiar, though Arjun couldn't place why. He opened it standing in the building's entrance hallway, morning light slanting through the glass doors. Inside was a single sheet of matching paper, folded once, with a single sentence in the same black ink. "You're going to regret today." That was all. No signature. No explanation. No context. Arjun stood holding the letter, trying to make sense of it. A prank? A threat? Some kind of mysterious game? He considered possibilities, a coworker with a strange sense of humor, a neighbor he'd somehow offended, a wrong address. None quite fit. But he had a bus to catch and a spreadsheet deadline looming, so he shoved the letter into his bag and mostly forgot about it until that evening when he found it again while looking for his keys. "You're going to regret today." What had happened today? He mentally reviewed, woke up, went to work, analyzed data, ate lunch, attended a meeting, analyzed more data, came home. Nothing regrettable. Nothing that stood out from any other day. His life was designed specifically to avoid regrettable moments. His phone sat on the counter, and he noticed he'd missed a call that afternoon. Dev. His younger brother, calling for the 3rd time this month. Arjun hadn't answered any of them. Kept meaning to call back but never quite getting around to it. They hadn't really spoken since the funeral, just a few brief, awkward texts. Arjun looked at the missed call, looked at the letter, felt a flutter of something uncomfortable in his chest that he immediately suppressed. Coincidence? Had to be. He threw the letter away and made tea. The next morning, 6:40 a.m., click-thud-click. Another cream-colored envelope. Same handwriting. This time he opened it immediately, standing in his doorway in his pajamas, morning cold raising goosebumps on his arms. "You did it again." Arjun's hands shook slightly. This wasn't coincidence. Someone was watching him. Someone knew about Dev's call. Someone was deliberately trying to, what? Make him feel guilty. Scare him. For what purpose? He went to work but couldn't concentrate. Kept thinking about the letters, about the handwriting that nagged at him with its familiarity. At lunch, instead of eating at his desk, he found a quiet corner and tried calling Dev. Straight to voicemail. Arjun hung up without leaving a message, relieved and disappointed in equal measure. That evening, he dug both letters out of the trash and laid them side by side on his kitchen counter, studying the handwriting under the harsh fluorescent light. The curves of the letters. The way the Y in U swooped down with particular emphasis. The slightly uneven spacing, as if the writer was emotional, not quite in control. It was familiar because he'd seen it before. Recently. Often. But he couldn't place where. The third letter arrived a week later, and this one made him sit down heavily on his couch, breath coming short. You still haven't forgiven yourself. And it's costing you more than you think. The handwriting. The phrasing. The knowledge of what lived in his chest like a stone, the guilt he never spoke aloud, the memory he avoided, the last call from his mother that he hadn't answered because he was in a meeting that wasn't even important, a weekly status update he could have skipped, and he'd meant to call her back during his break, but then he'd gotten caught up in a data problem, and then it was late, and he'd figured he'd call tomorrow, and tomorrow she was dying in a hospital, and there were no more calls, no more tomorrows, just the permanent absence where her voice used to be. Who could know this? He hadn't told anyone. Hadn't even let himself think it most of the time. He'd built his entire routine around not thinking it. Arjun stood up and walked to his closet, past the hanging shirts and trousers, past the shelf of folded items, to the back corner where a cardboard box sat unopened since he'd moved to this apartment 3 years ago. It was taped shut and labeled in his own handwriting, Mom's stuff plus old journals. He'd been meaning to sort through it. Had been meaning to for 3 years. Instead, he'd let it sit there, a contained mass of grief he never had to open. Now, with 3 letters laid out on his kitchen counter accusing him from the past or future or some impossible in-between, Arjun knelt and pulled the box into the light. The box opened with the crackling protest of old tape. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags gone slightly yellow with age, were his mother's belongings, her favorite sari, the one she wore for special occasions. Her reading glasses, still in their case. A jewelry box containing the simple pieces she'd worn daily. Photographs in frames that Arjun couldn't look at directly, catching only peripheral glimpses of her smile. And beneath those, journals. His journals, not hers. A stack of composition notebooks with marbled covers, their pages filled with his handwriting from different periods of his life. Teenage angst. College confusion. Early career frustration. He'd been a prolific journal keeper once, finding clarity through writing, processing emotions by translating them into words. Until he'd stopped. The last notebook was thinner than the others, and when Arjun opened it, he found entries that dated to the weeks immediately following his mother's death. The writing started normal enough: grief, confusion, guilt, the standard processing of loss. But then, partway through, the entries changed. The handwriting became rushed, almost frantic. The content became stranger. I can't remember yesterday. I know I went to work, but I don't remember the drive. I don't remember coming home. It's like hours just disappeared. Dr. Sharma says dissociation is normal after trauma. Says I'm protecting myself by disconnecting. But it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like drowning. Tried to write through it today. Ended up staring at a blank page for 2 hours. Where does time go when you're not present for it? And then, blank pages. 50, 60 pages of nothing. Except they weren't quite nothing. Arjun held the notebook up to the light and could see faint indentations, as if something had been written on pages that were no longer there. He flipped through more carefully and found that some pages had been torn out, not roughly, but carefully, along the binding. At least 20 pages missing. His chest felt tight. He didn't remember doing that. Didn't remember writing more and then removing the evidence. But memory, he was learning, was an unreliable narrator. Memory could be edited, censored, locked away in rooms you lost the keys to. He checked the dates of the last entries: March, 2 years ago. Around the time he'd started therapy at Dev's insistence, then quit after 4 sessions because the therapist kept pushing him to talk about things he wasn't ready to talk about, to feel things he'd successfully avoided feeling. Arjun set the journal aside and picked up the letters again, comparing the handwriting to his own journal entries. Different periods, different emotional states, but fundamentally the same hand. The same slight rightward slant. The same way that G in going looped back on itself. The same pressure on certain words, heavier when emotion was stronger. The letters were his. Written in his handwriting. Saying things he thought but never spoke. Knowing things he knew but never acknowledged. But he hadn't written them. Couldn't have written them. That would be impossible. Unless. Memory is unreliable, the therapist had said. Trauma creates gaps. Dissociation means being absent from your own life. It's possible to do things, say things, write things that you have no conscious memory of. Arjun thought about his mornings. How he'd wake at 6:37, anticipating the 6:40 arrival. How sometimes he'd lose time between waking and showering, find himself dressed without remembering getting dressed. How entire evenings would pass where he couldn't account for what he'd done, finding himself in bed with no memory of the hours between dinner and sleep. What if the letters weren't arriving from outside? What if he was writing them himself, in those dissociated gaps, and then forgetting? What if part of him, the part he'd buried, the part that still felt and thought and knew the truth, was trying to communicate with the conscious self that had gone numb? The idea should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt almost like relief. Because if he was writing the letters, then the surveillance wasn't external. The judgment wasn't coming from some cruel observer. It was just himself, trying to heal, trying to make the buried part heard. Arjun looked at his hands. These hands had held the phone that didn't answer his mother's last call. These hands sorted her belongings mechanically at the funeral. These hands had written journals he didn't remember writing, had perhaps written letters he didn't remember sending to himself. What else had they done that he couldn't recall? He opened his laptop and checked his search history, looking for gaps, for evidence of what he did during lost time. And there, scattered among the usual work-related searches and random Wikipedia spirals, were things he didn't remember looking up: dissociative disorder symptoms, processing grief when you feel numb, how to forgive yourself for things you can't change, letters to your future self. The last search was time-stamped at 3:47 a.m. 4 months ago. Arjun had no memory of being awake at 3:47 a.m. No memory of sitting at this laptop, searching for ways to communicate with himself. But he had been. Some version of him had been awake, struggling, trying to find a way through the numbness to the person he used to be. The next letter arrived 3 days later, and this time Arjun was ready for it. He'd stayed up late deliberately, made himself coffee at midnight, fought against sleep to see if he could catch himself in the act of creation. But at some point around 4 a.m., he must have dozed off at his kitchen table. When he woke, startled by the 6:40 click-thud-click, there was a cream-colored envelope on his table, unsealed, and his hand ached from writing. He didn't remember writing it. Didn't remember the hours between sitting down with coffee and waking to the mailbox sound. But the evidence was undeniable: empty cream-colored envelopes in his desk drawer that he didn't remember buying, a pen with black ink on his table, and his own handwriting staring up at him from the page he'd apparently just written. You don't need to punish yourself anymore. 7 words. Simple. Direct. From oneself to another across the gap of consciousness. Arjun sat at his kitchen table as morning light grew stronger, holding the letter, finally letting himself feel the weight of what he'd been carrying. The guilt. The grief. The self-imposed isolation. The routine built not for comfort but for anesthesia. The life made small and invisible because visibility meant vulnerability, meant feeling, meant accepting that he was a person who'd made mistakes and couldn't unmake them. His mother was gone. That call would stay forever unanswered. No amount of self-punishment would change it. No amount of avoiding his brother would bring her back. No amount of numbness would erase the fact that he'd chosen a meeting over calling her, and that choice had permanent consequences. But living in perpetual penance wasn't honoring her memory. It was just another form of absence, another way of not being present. She would have wanted him to live, actually live, not just exist in carefully controlled routines designed to avoid feeling anything. The buried part of himself, the part writing these letters, knew this. Had been trying to tell him for months. Arjun picked up his phone and called Dev before he could talk himself out of it. It was early, but Dev answered immediately, voice rough with sleep and surprise. Arjun? Are you okay? No, Arjun said, and felt something crack open in his chest. I'm not okay. But I want to be. Can we talk? They met at a chai stall near their mother's old house, the house Dev still lived in, maintaining it alone, surrounded by memories Arjun had been avoiding for 2 years. It was Saturday morning, bright and cold, the kind of day where the sun provided light but little warmth. Arjun arrived first, ordered 2 chais, and stood holding the paper cups, feeling awkward and uncertain and more present than he'd been in months. Dev appeared looking older than Arjun remembered, though it had only been, 6 months since the funeral. But grief ages people, and Dev had been carrying it alone, without the numbing routines Arjun had hidden behind. You look like hell, Dev said, but he was smiling slightly, and Arjun laughed, an unexpected sound that felt strange coming from his own throat. So do you. They stood there for a moment, 2 brothers who'd once been close, who'd grown apart through Arjun's deliberate isolation, now trying to find the bridge back. I'm sorry, Arjun said. For not calling. For not being there. After. Dev nodded slowly, accepting the chai. Why weren't you? The question was gentle but direct. Why? Not what happened or where have you been, but why, getting at the intention, the choice, the reason. Arjun thought about the letters. About the buried self trying to communicate. About all the things he'd avoided saying. Because I'm the older brother, he said finally. Because I was supposed to call her back. Because I was in a stupid meeting when she called, and I thought I'd call later, and there was no later. Because if I'd just answered the phone, I could have told her I loved her one more time. Or maybe she was already dying and I wouldn't have been able to do anything, but at least I would have tried. And I didn't. I chose work over her, and she died, and I can't fix it. The words came out in a rush, 2 years of suppressed guilt spilling into the space between them. Dev listened without interrupting, his expression soft with understanding rather than judgment. Arjun, he said when the silence stretched, she didn't die because you missed her call. I know that intellectually. No. Listen. Dev's voice was firm. I was there. I found her. She was already gone before the ambulance came. If you'd answered that call, you'd have had a nice conversation. But it wouldn't have changed what happened 3 days later. The stroke was massive. The doctors said even if someone had been with her when it happened, the outcome would be the same. But I would have said goodbye. You did say goodbye. Every time you talked to her, every visit, every stupid argument about politics or whether you were eating enough, all of it was saying, I love you, in different ways. She knew you loved her. One missed phone call doesn't erase 36 years of being her son. Arjun felt tears burning, threatening to spill over. He hadn't cried since the funeral. Hadn't let himself. I just wish. I know. I wish too. I wish I'd checked on her earlier that morning. I wish I'd insisted she see a cardiologist about those headaches. I wish I'd spent more time with her instead of always being busy. Dev's voice cracked slightly. But we can't live in, I wish. We have to live in what actually is. And what is, she loved us. We loved her. She's gone. And we're still here, still brothers, still carrying pieces of her forward. They talked for 2 hours, standing at that chai stall, ordering refills, letting the conversation wander through memories and grief and guilt and the slow, painful process of accepting things that can't be changed. Dev told stories Arjun had forgotten, their mother's terrible singing, her insistence on feeding every stray dog in the neighborhood, the way she'd worried about Arjun living alone, working too much, not letting anyone in. She used to ask me if you were okay, Dev said. I'd say yes because I didn't know any better. But you weren't, were you? Even before she died. No, Arjun admitted. I'd been disappearing for a while. Going through motions. The grief just made it easier to justify. What changed? Why call now? Arjun thought about the letters. About waking at his kitchen table with ink on his hands and no memory of writing. About the buried self that refused to stay buried, that fought through dissociation and numbness to deliver messages he needed to hear. I started getting letters, he said. From myself. Sort of. It's complicated. But they made me realize I can't keep living like I'm not alive. Mom wouldn't have wanted that. Dev smiled sadly. No. She'd have dragged you out of that apartment by your ear. They laughed, and it felt like healing, not complete, not finished, but beginning. The letters stopped coming after that conversation. Arjun checked his mailbox each morning, that 6:40 click thud click still marking time, but found only the usual bills and advertisements. The cream-colored envelope ceased appearing. The buried self, apparently satisfied that its message had been received and acted upon, went quiet. But Arjun started writing again. Real writing, conscious writing. Not letters to himself but a journal where he processed what he was feeling instead of suppressing it. Where he acknowledged the grief and guilt and slowly, gradually, worked toward forgiveness, not forgetting, but accepting the past as unchangeable and choosing to move forward anyway. He started therapy again, with a different therapist this time, and stuck with it even when it was uncomfortable. He called Dev regularly, rebuilt the relationship they'd once had. He sorted through his mother's belongings, kept some items that meant something, donated others where they'd be useful. He changed his routine, small changes at first, but disruptions to the numbing pattern, taking different routes to work, trying new restaurants, actually looking at himself in mirrors and acknowledging the person he saw there. 4 months after that conversation with Dev, on a morning when the 6:40 click thud click brought only bills, Arjun sat down and wrote one final letter on cream-colored paper in his own handwriting, conscious and deliberate. Dear Arjun, you did your best. You couldn't have known. And you're allowed to live even though she's gone. She would have wanted that. Would have insisted on it. Forgive yourself. Not because the guilt wasn't real, but because carrying it forever doesn't serve anyone, not her memory, not your brother, not you. You're allowed to be okay. You're allowed to heal. You're allowed to be present in your own life again. With compassion, yourself. He sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to himself, and placed it in his mailbox at exactly 6:40 a.m. Then he walked away, leaving it there for the postman to find and presumably return to him according to the strange postal logic that governs self-addressed mail. When he checked that evening, the letter was gone. Where it went, he never discovered. But he didn't need to receive it. Writing it was the point. Forgiving himself, out loud and on paper, was the point. The buried self and the conscious self, finally speaking the same language. Finally moving in the same direction. Finally, slowly, becoming whole again. Sometimes the voice we fear most is our own, because it knows the truth. It knows what we're avoiding, what we're suppressing, what we're pretending not to feel. It knows the guilt we carry, the grief we refuse to process, the forgiveness we won't grant ourselves. We spend enormous energy trying to outrun this voice. We build routines designed to drown it out. We numb ourselves with busyness, with substances, with entertainment, with anything that keeps us from sitting in silence with our own thoughts. We construct elaborate defenses, dissociation, rationalization, projection, denial. But the voice persists. It has to. Because buried feelings don't disappear, they just find other ways to surface. Through anxiety. Through depression. Through physical illness. Through sabotaged relationships. Through the strange, persistent sense that you're living someone else's life, going through motions without actually being present. Arjun's story is extreme in its specifics. Most of us aren't writing letters to ourselves in dissociative states. But the underlying dynamic is universal, the part of ourselves that knows the truth, fighting to be heard by the part that's too afraid or too wounded or too numb to listen. What truths are you avoiding? What voice inside you keeps trying to speak, and what are you doing to silence it? Maybe it's guilt about a relationship you've let deteriorate. Maybe it's grief you never properly processed. Maybe it's anger you've suppressed because you're supposed to be the calm one, the reasonable one, the one who keeps it together. Maybe it's fear that admitting you're struggling would make you weak or burdensome or somehow less valuable. Whatever it is, the voice knows. And it's trying to tell you. Not to punish you, despite how it might feel, but to help you. To move you toward healing. To remind you that being human means feeling things, even uncomfortable things, and that the path through pain is through it, not around it. Listening to that voice requires courage. It means dropping the defenses you've carefully constructed. It means feeling things you've been avoiding. It means acknowledging truths about yourself and your life that might be difficult to accept. But the alternative, continuing to run, continuing to numb, continuing to build your life around avoidance, has a cost that compounds over time. You become a stranger to yourself. You live a half-life, present in body but absent in spirit. You miss opportunities for genuine connection because you're too defended to be vulnerable. You accumulate regrets while telling yourself you're being practical. The buried voice, your voice, is offering you a way out. It's saying, look at this thing you're avoiding. Feel this feeling you're suppressing. Forgive yourself for this mistake you keep punishing yourself for. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. But it's the only way to become whole again. So listen. Not just to the conscious thoughts you allow yourself, but to what emerges in quiet moments, in dreams, in the persistent discomfort that won't quite go away no matter how well you distract yourself. Listen to what your body is telling you through tension and exhaustion and the particular kind of fatigue that comes from carrying unprocessed emotion. And then do the hard work, therapy if you need it, journaling, honest conversations with people you trust, sitting with uncomfortable feelings instead of immediately reaching for something to numb them. The specific methods matter less than the commitment to actually engaging with yourself truthfully instead of performing normalcy while dying internally. You deserve to be whole. You deserve to live in your life instead of observing it from a safe distance. You deserve the peace that comes from forgiving yourself, processing grief, acknowledging fear, accepting your full humanity with all its messy complications. The voice you fear, your own voice, speaking truth you've been avoiding, isn't your enemy. It's your guide. It's the part of you that refuses to let you disappear entirely, that keeps trying to bring you back to presence, to feeling, to authentic existence. Listen to it. Trust it. Follow where it leads, even when that direction is uncomfortable. Because on the other side of that discomfort is healing. On the other side of that truth is freedom. On the other side of finally listening to yourself is the possibility of actually being yourself again. Be StoryWise.